It was Aaron's rod that budded, that teaches us of redemption, how that God, even though sin has been committed, and even though the law had been broken, that God can still bring life out of something that had died, that God can still redeem men even though the commandments had been broken. But there was a third thing in that ark, and it was a bowl of manna that had been placed in that ark. You know what God was the manna represented? It represented that God had provided for them, and God had been there to meet their needs. Listen to me this morning. Not only did they have the promise of accomplishment, not only did they have the presence of the Almighty, but listen, thirdly, they had the proof of assistance. As they went into battle, here come the Ark of the Covenant, carrying everything that pointed back to what God had already done for them, how that they had sinned against God, and God had redeemed them and brought them back, how God had met their every need. And as they went into battle, they could look at that Ark of the Covenant, and the armed men would know that God had been there back for them way back when, and that God had been provided for their needs way back then, and God had not left them alone way back then. And they know walking into battle that if God had not forsaken them in the past, that God was not going to forsake them in the present, that God was still the same yesterday, today, and forever. And they could look back at the past and see that God had been faithful and God was still faithful. Oh, listen to us. How many times in our life in the past can we look back and see the hand of God working in our life, see the hand of God moving in our life, seeing the hand of God calm the storms in our life, seeing God calm us in the middle of storms previously in our life, see the number of times that the God of heaven has met your needs and met mine, and time again in the past in our life, we can look back and see a God who has been nothing but faithful and will always be faithful. He's not changed. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. The God of heaven's not changed. He's not lost his power, and the same God that's been faithful to me and my family in the past will be faithful to me in the present, and will be faithful to us in the future. He's the same God, and we can look back and see that there was proof of his assistance. There's proof in my life that he is still there. How can you look back on the times in your life and see how the God of heaven's been there in other battles and in other conflicts and in other confusion? He's still been there, and he's still there today. I think back upon the times of my life, and all of us could do that this morning. That's walked with God and lived for him any length of time. Can look back on those things. I look back on the things in my life where God showed up, and he showed me that he could be trusted. How many times we look back on those things and say, God taught me something right back there. And that lesson that he taught me there is still true today. I never forget years ago, I was about 8 or 9 years old at the time, one of my favorite stories in my life, because it was a time when God showed me that he could be trusted. I'll forget when my dad was in Bible college, we had a car that was on its last leg, maybe it was on its last wheel, I don't know how you say that, but it was a mess. And I never forget, we had been praying as a family, us kids, parents and kids have been praying, because this car needed about $1,000 worth of repairs done to it. I was in Bible college at the time, homeschooling. We didn't have the money, and I always appreciated the fact that my parents taught me that God was working and that God could be trusted. When we faced this need and had the money for it, and this car was it was a mess and needed all this work, so we started praying as a family. I'll never forget this as long as I live. We started praying as a family that God would send $1,000 to fix that vehicle. We needed it. We needed to get back and forth. And I'll never forget at that time in my life, I had faced a time where I got old enough I started thinking about some things in my mind. And I'll never forget, my dad come home one day, and he would come home from work. And as he walked in the front door, I'd finally been battling these things in my mind. And I asked Dad, I said, Dad, how do we know that the God we worship is the true God? I'll never forget asking him that question, because it was such a problem in my mind. He said, what do you mean? I said, well, all the people in this world worship different gods, and they believe that their God is true. How do we know that the God we worship is the true God? And these questions are so confusing in my mind. And I'll never forget this, because as Dad walked in the door, he had stopped at the mailbox and was going through the mail. He was looking through that mail, and as I'm asking this question, at some point, he stopped sorting the mail and just listened to me finish my question. My dad didn't say a whole lot at the time, but he reached over and handed me an envelope that had come in the mail that morning. He said, "Son, this is how I know that God is real." I looked in that envelope, and in that envelope was a check for $1,000. The exact amount that we had been praying for as a family, the exact amount that we needed to meet our need. And God took that money that day and He fixed an old Chevy Malibu. But can I tell you something? On that day, there was something far greater than any mechanical fix that needed on a car. There was something more than just a car that needed to get back on the road. On that day, there was a God in heaven that looked down at a 9-year-old boy and said, "He's got some questions in his mind. He's searching after me. I'm going to show him something today that he'll never forget, because I'm going to show him that when he prays, I hear him. That when he has a need, I'll be there. When he seems forsaken, he'll know that I'm there." I can't tell you how many times, Brother Connie, I've looked back on that day of my life and remembered that God is real and that God could be trusted. And the God that was there for me in the past is the same God that will be there for me in the future. And listen, as we face the fortified cities in our life, we have the proof of His assistance. He's been there before, and He'll be there again. How many times can we look back and see just how God has met our needs? Oh, listen, one of these days I hope God lets me write a book about the ways that He has provided and that He has met and that He has been there and that He has overcome and that He has been victorious. He gave them the proof of assistance. But lastly, this morning, look in verse number 13. Not only did they have the promise of accomplishment, not only did they have the presence of the Almighty and the proof of assistance, but number 4, look in verse number 13, there was the promise of aid. Look in verse number 13. 7 priests bearing 7 trumpets of ram's horn before the ark of the Lord went on continually and blew with the trumpets. And the armed men went before them, but the reward came after the ark of the Lord, the priest going on and blowing with the trumpets. You get the idea that God was very specific on how He wanted things to take place. Look what He says in verse number 13. The reward came after the ark of the Lord, the priest going on and blowing with the trumpets. Has anybody here this week used the word reward in your everyday conversation? It's not a word that we typically use anymore. I got to studying one time, Brother Brian. I started studying that reward and what it was. Brother Brian's a military man, understand this.